So we have lots of stereotypes in the United States about how people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds speak and talk. And the idea here would be, that's a reflection not of language, but that's a reflection of their power in society and their place within society. Okay, so those are some of the basics then on language and power. Okay, you often will hear this called language politics. And so people will say, oh, linguistic anthropologists today, they study language politics. They study this other jargony thing now that I've mentioned, language ideologies. But these are really simple things. Language and thought, language and knowledge, we can't really think without language. We probably all think in different languages depending on what we're thinking about. Politics, we often don't define like political scientists, government decision-making. Politics is really about power. So if you're looking at, language politics, we're talking about knowledge, power complexes. And we've probably run into these before. A lot of this comes out of linguistic anthropology. You might just cite Foucault, but you've always got people like Mikhail Bakhtin in the early 20th century from Russia, and people like Sapir, who really were talking about these things early on. I'd even point back to Walter Benjamin, one of the most important academics to work on media back in the 1920s and 30s, was really actually concerned with how the fascists in Germany were using media at the time to push a certain type of ideology and a certain type of language. And so they were talking about language and power early in the 20th century. It's quite fascinating, especially around the times of fascism. Okay, so language and politics. A couple things I just want to mention. Okay, we're probably familiar with the power of naming. Okay, that's linguistic. And this is maybe the simplest example that you can come up with, again, of the power of just simply language, especially in the colonial era, especially if we're going to talk about indigenous communities. I worked in Africa. Africa, a lot of people don't realize, is the continent that has most of the world's linguistic diversity. There are more languages in Africa than in any other continent. And that's because of another thing people don't know about Africa is that it was colonized last. It was the last of the major continents to be colonized. And it's one of the reasons it retains so much linguistic diversity. However, that's often a real surprise to people. People often don't know how big Africa is, right? This is part of that the erasure that took place through colonial history. I know I'm dropping a couple of names here, but another one, and I'm sure I can attach a little bibliography to this, but Mary Louise Pratt, if anybody's familiar with Mary Louise Pratt, one of my favorite books, Imperial Eyes from 1992, she talks all about this process of seeing, right? Naming, mapping, and then you can erase, then you can take, right? Then you can extract, which is what much of this was about. And so when you look at something like, and I'll get back to language ideologies in a second, but if you look at something like, Colonialism 101, this is language, right? There's language, there's literally English language written on here, but the lines have been drawn in a way that is fundamentally about empowering and disempowering groups of people. But the other important line on this map, if anybody's familiar with the classic colonial map, the Mercator map, a good reminder that colonialism is still ongoing, that we use this map at all. But right, there's your equator, right? So what I would argue, this is a fundamentally racist map. What it's doing is it's reproducing really, really powerful racial distinctions and disparities by shrinking the southern part of the globe, right? And putting all the focus on the north. And we live with this, we deal with this. The absurdity of Greenland somehow being bigger than South America or Africa on this map, right? However, and I'm gonna get to this point, this is the optimism from all of this, is that we can also counter map, right? There are other ways that we can map things. Many of you have probably seen the Gall-Peters projection, which just gives you a look at the world if all of the land masses were in the proper relation in terms of size, right? And what you see suddenly, and this always, it's funny, I show this to students and they're like, what's wrong with this map, right? There's a literacy here that they didn't know that they had, a visual literacy for the map. And all of a sudden this really sort of shocks them, right? Now I use the map that doesn't have names and doesn't have lines written on it, which is also, you could say, erasing the people that could be all over these maps. But there's a lot that we can do with maps, just in terms of shifting the equator to be in the middle. So you can play with this a lot. I used to always, I mentioned Africa, when I would come back from research in Africa, I'd often have people say things like, what do they speak? Do they speak African? Did you learn African? The number of people, educated people, who asked me that was quite shocking. It's like, well, actually they have more languages than anywhere else. And so you can see this is about language, but this is also about geography. This is about different types of symbolism. And again, it's about our mind. It's about how we think about things. And some of you may have seen these maps, but again, this is a type of visual language that's used, right? In what really is a meme, okay? To educate and to teach.